Alright, hello everyone, welcome to Office Hours, where we answer questions, give philosophical perspectives, formulate and explore arguments, and deep dive into particular topics of your choice. Jane writes, Cultural Marxism has an all-consuming fixation on power dynamics, always looking outward with an envious eye. Calling out Marxism is an important antidote, but at the same time, I yearn to be drawn to something higher, philosophically. Which philosophies can we look to teach us about thriving and seeking excellence for its own sake? I swear to God I didn't see this question. Oh man. I love this one for more personal reasons because it ties into a lot of my own work. So I will try to not make this all about myself, and we'll try to be a little bit more expansive in our answer here. So, off the bat, it actually is an open philosophical question what the purpose of philosophy is. You know, what is the purpose of philosophy is a philosophical question, and it lends itself to perhaps multiple answers. But for me personally, it has always been about what is the good life. My wife used to make fun of me. In fact, she maybe still does occasionally for a particular phrasing I've had, and I've never been able to get away from. But the phrase I've used is I don't want to mislive. She always thought that was a bad conjugation of the phrase, but it sticks, and it's been memorable to me, and it's been something that has been on my mind personally since high school. That phrase, the idea of misliving, not wanting to mislive. But that in itself is negative. And so, like, what's the opposite would be, how do you live a good life? And the inspiration for that actually came from a little Stoic book by a gentleman named William Irving called A Guide to the Good Life. Now, I happen to have a kind of nostalgic fondness for Stoicism, but I don't think it's actually the best answer to the question here, because it's again very negatively focused, what not to do more than what you should do. Although Stoicism does come to some answers about excellence and promotes what will be our first answer here. But I don't think this is just my opinion. I do think there is a history going back beyond the continental philosophers and the analytic philosophers to the days of the ancients. We have a sort of hint of this idea of philosophy being about the good life in Plato's Republic. The opening of the philosophical part of the discussion begins with Socrates interrogating Cephalus about what it's like being old. And you get this kind of retrospective look on life and where life has taken this old man, and what are the good ways of living and the bad ways of living retrospectively from the position of someone who is at the threshold of old age, which is the euphemism for about to die. And so you don't want to wind up on your deathbed with regrets. You don't want to wind up on your deathbed thinking, oh, I did this all wrong. You don't. So that perspective focuses our attention on what matters. And maybe if philosophia, if the wisdom implied in the Sophia that we are phileo, that we are loving, is something positive, if there's a positive wisdom of these are the good things in life, then philosophy is not just about knowing what's false and what to avoid and what not to do, but is also about what is good and maybe even how to cultivate it, hopefully, although that might be a different domain. And maybe everything else in philosophy, the epistemology, the metaphysics, is just brush clearing so we can get to the good stuff. Now, obviously, as I've already said, not all philosophers agree on this. It is a question, but if the questioner here is asking for the good stuff, then we have philosophers who've given us pathways to something like an answer to this question. And the first one is an ancient and a student of Plato's and Socrates, and that is Aristotle. Answer 1. Aristotle, and specifically Aristotle's virtue ethics. Now, when Aristotle talks about virtue, he basically just means excellence. But he doesn't mean excellence in the singular sense. There are many excellences. There are many virtues. And he talks about virtue very often as a kind of Aristotelian mean, not his phrase obviously, but our phrase describing his idea of virtue being a sort of midpoint between two vices. So, for example, cowardice is a deficiency of courage, but foolhardiness is like an excess of courage. And so the goal in Aristotle's virtue ethics is to reach what he calls eudaimonia, which is often very badly translated as happiness. It's not. The root eudaimonia, the eu just means good, and the daimonia means like spirited. So you can see how someone might translate this as happiness. But it really means something closer to like a good disposition, being the sort of person who has the character to do the right thing. It's not in many ways it's not even about how you feel, although Aristotle does care about that. He thinks it's good to feel good, and that having this good spirit is the best way to achieve that. But even if you don't feel good, it's still the ethical thing to do is to develop this good spirit. But he's not a systems guy. He doesn't think there's a way, if we just conceptualize everything right in some kind of like Kantian categorical imperative, we'll have an algorithmic system that tells us what to do. What we have to do is develop these virtues in ourselves, so that when the chaos and complexity of the ever-changing world hits us, in its own unique way, in our own unique context and setting, we will have the disposition to do what is right and to know what is good. And so Aristotle's idea is that we develop, we consciously train our character like an athlete. And in doing so, we become virtuous and we become excellent in our craft, in our relationships, in our physical beauty. Magnificence was one of his virtues. And just in all domains of our life. And this is a lifelong undertaking, of course. That was that. So that's Aristotle. That's answer 1. I'm mixing the German and the American here. The second answer I'll give, going back to German apparently, because we're about to talk about a German, is someone I mentioned at some length in a recent video. You might guess that I'm a fan of this character, and that's Martin Heidegger and his phenomenology, which also belongs to Edmund Husserl. And the idea of phenomenology, I'll explain the roots here, just like I did with eudaimonia. Phenomenon was a distinction that, of all people, Immanuel Kant made. He was distinguishing in his attempt to reach some kind of epistemological bedrock so he could save the possibility of knowledge. Discussion for another time. I'm getting distracted. He made a distinction, a categorical distinction between the noumena, which is a Greek word which refers to the things in themselves, the actual objects in the world. This, ostensibly, there is a noumenal cup in here. But all we see, what is present to us, is the phenomena, the appearance of the cup. And that, by the way, extends to how it feels in my hand, how it tastes, and so forth. Is this water, or is there propel in here? So all we have access to is the phenomena. not the noumena. And this was a problem for Kant. He wanted true knowledge, and so that's why he retreated into ontology and to what he called a priori knowledge, things that you could know prior to experience. But Edmund Husserl went the other way. He said, well, if we don't have access to the noumena, screw it. We will study the phenomena, and we will develop a relationship with the phenomena, and we will study it with the seriousness of a science. And he was an extremely prolific writer. he was one of the more hardcore, underrated philosophers of the late 19th and early 20th century. Very tragic, because he was a Jewish man, so he became unappreciated at an early part of the 20th century in Germany. But thankfully, one of his top students, who took a lot from him, was ethnically German, so he was allowed to continue at least until the war ended, and then he was discarded in a similar way. And that was Martin Heidegger. And Martin Heidegger, I think, took what Husserl started, which was a brilliant and, dare I say, phenomenal turn from the sort of analytic tradition and the overly, I'll say overly scientific, and what we would call positivist philosophy that had been dominating the study, and turned it into something that was, later people tried to claim it was kind of existential, but it was really about developing a relationship with the world around us and not getting lost in the clouds, as Aristophanes might have criticized Socrates for being. And I'm maybe going on too long here. The basic idea that Heidegger is giving to us, which is an extremely complex and dense book, Being and Time is, but the basic, overly simplified, dumbed down idea is that the question of being that he's investigating, what is the meaning of being, is not answerable. We are not in a position to answer it until we develop a better relationship with being. We have to be in the world. We have to be present in the world in order to even reach a place where we can begin to approach this question. He believed we'd built up so much baggage, so much conceptual, philosophical scaffolding that we couldn't even see the thing itself anymore in a way that the ancients did. So a lot of his work was aimed at deconstruction, and again, I might be repeating myself from a previous video, but not deconstruction in a leftist Marxist sense, not like this is condemned so it must be deconstructed and destroyed because we hate it, but rather we need to deconstruct, we need to dust away the dirt from the face of the beauty that is being underneath, so we can appreciate it, and then maybe build our own things on top of it, but with a clearer perspective of the foundation that we're building off of. So it's tearing down some walls, not so that we can just get rid of them, but so that we can see the foundation again and get a better sense of our footing, and then maybe build back. I'm not going to say it. build with a better foundation. Now, Heidegger doesn't actually give us an answer of what the meaning of being is. This is just to get us to a place where we can begin to answer that question. But sort of incidental to that, what being in the world means is paying attention to the world, being present. And in this being and presence is a connection with the world. And I believe that competence and excellence naturally follows from this connection. So it's a little bit different focus than Aristotle, which is like, let's just develop excellence so that you can develop character. For Aristotle, it's all about character. For Heidegger, it's all about being and this question of being, and everything is kind of a means to the end of getting to a place so that we can begin to approach this question of being. But strangely, they kind of wind up in the same place, even though they get there by different roads. Which brings us to my third answer. I'm going back to the American. I don't know what's wrong with me. Well, we're talking, we're jumping continents here, because our third answer, our third philosophy to explore, is Zen Buddhism. Now, I say this with an asterisk because I am very much not a fan of mainline Buddhism. I think Buddhism, as it is generally practiced, Buddhism proper, we might say, Orthodox Buddhism, is actually a fairly nihilistic religion. It masquerades as being something else. It says, oh, nirvana doesn't mean actually blown out. It has this other connotation, whatever. It's, you're just getting rid of dukkha, which is the suffering of desire or attachments or whatever. I don't, I've gone into it elsewhere at length, but Zen Buddhism is different. You could analogize, you could say Zen Buddhism is to Buddhism almost as Mormonism is to Christianity. By the way, I like Mormons. I like Mormonism. I'm not a Mormon. But and what you find in Zen Buddhism, broadly speaking, is Zen Buddhism came from a military tradition. It was very much about martial prowess and excellence. But what they developed was an entire spiritual doctrine around perfection of spirit and character by means of perfection of a particular skill. And it didn't really matter what skill that was. It could be, swordsmanship, or it could be flower arrangement, or, origami or cooking, or anything can be a method to a vehicle by which one practices Zen and refines your skill through Zen. And there's still a kind of selflessness that they aim for that sounds semantically similar to nirvana but is not. It is much closer to a kind of flow state of being that again winds up at a place that is strangely similar to Aristotle's virtue ethics and even Heidegger's phenomenology, but arrives there at kind of by means of a different route. So before I get to the last one, the personal one I was alluding to at the beginning, I want to give out an honorable mention as well, another Eastern one that there is some value to, but it's only an honorable mention because it's very vague, and it takes a lot of time to unpack, and that's Taoism. Taoism, if you have the time and the patience to dwell on it and think about it for a very long time, you can get some very good stuff out of it. It's one of those ones where you can read like a line or two a day and just think on it, and it probably won't reveal its meaning initially. And so it won't get you to the path of excellence directly, but I believe it's the sort of thing that will indirectly eventually get you there. And it is fundamentally about it captures a lot of that positive wisdom in the world, though it also tells you some things to avoid and so forth. But it's not as clearly, it's not as aesthetically oriented, I'll say, as Zen Buddhism and phenomenology and virtue ethics. So we'll leave it as an honorable mention. Which brings us to our final recommendation, and this is a more recent one from here in the United States, and that is solar idealism, which I am proud to be a sort of contributing part of. This really comes from the work of Jack Donovan, and his work, Fire in the Dark. It's about it's really about exactly this. It is his philosophical answer to exactly this question. There's an analogy in the domain of psychology. For many years, psychologists were attempting to study the human mind and to come to understand the human mind by studying the pathologies. And they think, if we can understand how the brain goes wrong, that will give us a baseline of what the brain is supposed to be like. But it turned out there were epistemological problems with this. And this led to a movement in psychology called positive psychology, which was the attempt to get a positive baseline of what does a positive, properly functioning brain actually look like. And I feel like solar idealism is in many ways the philosophical analog to that. It draws a lot from the work of Friedrich Nietzsche and from Yukio Mishima, but it does go a step beyond, Thus Spake Zarathustra or Sun and Steel, although it incorporates a lot of that. It's even Nietzsche's attempt at the ideal of attempt at an answer to this question, the ideal that he called the Overman or the Übermensch, which Jack and I had actually a long conversation about when we went over Thus Spake Zarathustra. And the Overman is actually a trickier concept to unpack than it at first appears. Like the man that you are overcoming is not biological humanity, but this concept of the last man that Nietzsche explains elsewhere. So even his attempt at a positive ideal is still framed in the negative a little bit, but there's still a good groundwork there, and Mishima, I think, develops that even further. And I think what Jack Donovan has created with solar idealism and Fire in the Dark, it from this foundation in philosophy, solar idealism sort of finds an insufficiency of positivity in philosophy itself, but that opens the door to myth and art and physicality. And Mishima was really the doorway to physicality. If you want that sort of philosophical foundation, Yukio Mishima is the place to go. And all of this sort of begins with dissatisfaction with the pure linguistics. So that negativity, when you're coming from philosophy, it's always going to kind of be there, but there's still a positive ideal in Mishima, and that is sun and steel. I'm going to get jacked and tan, says this 1970s Japanese bodybuilder, writer turned bodybuilder, who's, it's worth mentioning, was himself dramatically influenced by both Nietzsche and by the ancient Greeks. Many of the stories he wrote were direct adaptations of, Sophocles and Euripides and so forth. So what solar idealism does is it makes that leap from just trying to find good in philosophy, which can be very dissatisfying because philosophy at the end of the day is kind of just words. That's what it is. That's how it's done anyways. But it uses philosophy as a justification and a framework to find the good in these grander mediums, art, myth, and the body itself, and to reground the legitimacy of myth and aspirational heroes within a culture that largely looks down on heroes and aspirations as, hero worship as a bad thing. And I guess another person you could point to is oh man, his name is escaping me. Thomas Carlyle. Heroes and hero worship. That's not the only good thing he's written, but and now more is coming to me. Curtis Yarvin, of course, has become a big advocate of pursuing excellence, although that's framed in the context of politics and not wanting to pursue political power, which is another Plato's Republic reference. So it's, and again, I believe our project in solar idealism, in many ways, comes to a very similar conclusion as Zen Buddhism and Heidegger's phenomenology and Aristotle's virtue ethics. So there's a question, why do this separate thing at all? Well, first of all, I think we add to it, but second of all, I think different times and places require different arguments and different justifications. And I think the argument behind solar idealism speaks to Americans in America and in Western Europe today in a way that is more deeply necessary, and in a way that phenomenology, which has already been very tragically, as we talked about in the previous video, been somewhat co-opted, and it's a little tricky to get into and to understand, doesn't. And Zen Buddhism has become, there's so much good in Zen Buddhism, but it's limited in its own ways, perhaps for cultural, contextual reasons. And I'm going to be honest, Aristotle's virtue ethics is just tough reading. It's very dull, even for philosophy, and again, it's very conceptual. It doesn't the application is implied, but it's not explicated in quite the same way. And I think there's a lot more beauty in the answer to these kinds of questions when myth and heroes are brought back in. So you might be asking, are there particular books that you would recommend? I've mentioned a fair number of books, beginning with a Stoic book, and obviously, if we're talking about Aristotelian virtue ethics, the book to read is Nicomachean Ethics by Aristotle. I would hold it up. My copy's on the shelf over there. It's a dense read. I wouldn't recommend it. I would recommend reading the first two books. If you can get through the first two chapters, you basically got what he's got to say, and you don't need to punish yourself by getting through them more. And it is readable. It's tedious, but it's not terribly hard. If you are curious about Heidegger's phenomenology, the book to read is, unfortunately, Being in Time. And I say unfortunately because that is the hardest book I've ever attempted to read. It is extremely challenging. Very rewarding if you can get through it, but insanely difficult. If you are interested in looking into Zen Buddhism, the best book I have read on it, and I've read it a couple of times now, is a short little book by a German named called Zen in the Art of Archery by Eugene Herrigel. Excellent read. Is a simple book, very readable, to the point, conveys the idea very, very directly, very clearly, and is worth reading. And of course, if you are interested in solar idealism, Fire in the Dark is the book to read on that. And there's also, of course, over my shoulder here, this one right here, the Pater Anthology, which I'm very proud to be a contributing writer for. And I think my essay, Descending Odin's Throne, has a lot of good stuff in there about these kinds of questions. But if you're looking for maybe just one book that kind of gets to the heart of all of this stuff, kind of puts together, touches on a little bit of Aristotle, but more Plato, because it's worth mentioning here that Plato arguably, Plato's a little bit trickier to read, but Plato arguably introduces the idea of virtue ethics all the way back in the Republic, maybe before Aristotle, but he's a little bit trickier to read. But anyways, if you're looking for a book that maybe combines the ancient Greeks with a little bit of more modern German stuff, and a little bit of Zen and a little bit of myth, there's a wonderful novel. It's perhaps my favorite book, contemporary book anyways, called Zen in the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance by Robert Pirsig. I cannot recommend it highly enough. It's very enjoyable. If you are sort of experienced and advanced in philosophy, there's stuff for you at the end. If you are kind of a novice and just like a fun kind of story that hints at some of these ideas, it's readable in that light too. It's a beautiful little story. It's not short, but it's not terribly difficult most of the time. It might take a few reads through, but it addresses this whole subject through the lens of exploring what quality is. What is quality? Is quality the sort of thing that can even be defined? Is it something we know when we see it, or does it follow a set of classical rules? And what is a quality motorcycle? Is it an experience, or is it is it a part of the thing itself? All of those kinds of questions, and how are we to have a relationship with quality? How do we develop quality in ourselves in relationship to the world? Are all brought up very, very well by that book, and it's a wonderful introduction to all of this stuff and to living a sort of a life with virtue and excellence in relationship to the world that we live in. And I can't recommend it highly enough. Even I always feel bad putting my own stuff at the top of lists. I would recommend my essay Descending Odin's Throne, again in the shoulder Patera anthology here, as well as Jack Donovan's excellent Fire in the Dark, and all of these other ones, and hopefully all of these books serve as inspirations and springboards to other books. I'm of the belief that philosophy is this giant, there's like this giant trampoline, but there's a big heavy weight in the middle. So you can go around, but the more you go around, you'll spiral down towards the center, and that big heavy weight in the center of the trampoline, pulling everything in like a black hole, is Plato's Republic. It will get you eventually if you stay on that trampoline long enough. And it's an ambiguous book. It doesn't tell you anything directly, but I do think it implies an obligation to virtue and excellence. And while it has a sort of philosophical bias in terms of what Plato seems to imply excellence looks like in practice, Aristotle, I think, fleshes this out nicely and says, in fact, there are many excellences. There's no shortage of things to become good at in this world, and beauty to create, and excellent complex machines to build or fix, as the case may be. And it's why virtue is a lifelong undertaking. So I hope that's at least the beginning of an answer to a lifelong question as to how to find, where to look in philosophy for how to thrive and find excellence and virtue intrinsically for its own sake. There's no shortage of answers, but those are, I think, four excellent starting points. So I hope that is helpful. 5 if we include Robert Pirsig. So I hope that's helpful. Thanks again for the wonderful and very good, and I promise not seeded, planted question. Thanks so much for listening, and take care.